Hi, this is Alex King. It's Friday, February 12th, 2010, and this is Coot Vlog 6. So I thought I would actually talk some more about Avatar, basically because that's what's been running through my head this past week. Last week I talked about how anthropology seems to be irrelevant watching that movie, that understanding other cultures, even as radically different as aliens, is doesn't require any sort of anthropology. And I found that kind of depressing. And today I'd like to talk about why anthropology would be useful, and how if Cameron had a more anthropological sensibility, or even better, if he went and got himself an anthropologically sensible author to write that movie. And there's plenty of those. You know, Ian M. Banks and Ursula Le Guin, even Frank Herbert. You know, there's many examples of science fiction authors who do have an anthropological sensibility. And that can really be summed up in two words. The first is reductionism, and that's a bad thing. And the second is sui generis, and that's something that anthropologists like to do. So, starting with sui generis, it's literally translated from the Latin. It means of its own kind, or other words, can mean on its own terms. And this is something that anthropologists really strive to do, is to understand the other on their own terms. And of course, anthropologists study their own culture as well, but they bring these similar sorts of analytic tools that have been developed through the history of the discipline of studying radically different other people, whether those be Native American cultures or people in faraway lands. The one thing that really bugs me about Avatar is the reductionism that runs all through that movie, and the sort of implicit understandings that the audience gets in from the characters, particularly the biologist played by Sigourney Weaver. You know, they're out there poking at the trees and the plants and collecting samples and testing the sort of communicative properties of tree roots, and they discover that they seem to be carrying electrical charges and communicating with one another, much like neurons in a brain communicate with one another inside your head. And so she and her team come to this interesting conclusion that the entire planet is interwoven, much like a brain is interwoven in this exchange of electrical charges. And indeed, we see that in a lot of other scenes, you know, with these USB tails that the Pandorans have, the Na'vi people have these tails that they kind of then plug into horses to do horse stuff, you know, ride a horse, and they plug it into their dragons to do dragon stuff and ride their dragon, and they plug it into each other to do each other stuff, you know, in that kind of intimate way. And when they're praying to the ancestors or Ewa, a god, they then plug it into the sacred tree. So what we have in the movie here is a limited imagination of reducing really complicated stuff to a sort of mechanistic understanding of consciousness. That consciousness is nothing more than the kind of electrical stuff going on inside your head, and that so the movement of consciousness is the movement of these electrical charges around. Failed ceremony where Sigourney Weaver's character fails to have her consciousness permanently transferred from her injured human body to the uninjured but apparently soulless, and that's actually never really very well explained, Na'vi body fails because she's too weak. But of course, the real problem is that there can be only one. You know, and just as in Highlander, there's only one left standing at the end, even if that happens 3 times or so with all the sequels. There can be only one, and so it would be really complicated if the Scully character were to be able to leave behind his damaged and unloved and forlorn sort of human body and embrace fully this brave new alien world. Well, it'd be really complicated if he were also joined by this scientist who was not necessarily alienated from her own people and her own self in the same way that Scully is, but rather this is a sort of emergency operation to prevent her from dying as she's bleeding to death. If that had been successful, that would have been really complicated now ending, and would have, I think, provided some really interesting opportunities for sequels in this movie. Now you've got someone who has been inducted into the culture, made a full member of the tribe, through all those rituals and trials. And then you've got this alien in the same kind of body, these dreamwalkers as they call them, also living with them, but not incorporated. And so what's she going to do? Is she going to be a sort of cultural intermediary? Which there's a long history of that in contact between European societies and indigenous peoples, whether it's in the far north or other places. These cultural intermediaries are often biracial. These kinds of biracial people had very particular skill sets that would allow them to tack back and forth. But that was also a disadvantage of having that kind of liminal position, and so that they'd be shunned as half-breed by both peoples, actually. What I'm saying is that it would be really nice if Cameron could go get himself a real writer with some really complex imagination to imagine a more complicated world in Pandora, where there are lots of things going on that are just impossible to understand. And you do see that in science fiction. There's plenty of stuff going on in Star Trek, for example, that just doesn't make any sense. And the more you try and figure it out, it just doesn't all work. And that's one of the things I like about it, that they don't try and answer all your questions. Another example of reductionism, of reducing complicated things that our mind can't fully comprehend into some sort of concrete, mechanistic billiard ball causality. Anyway, Avatar is a fun movie. Lots of good action. I like a good shoot 'em up. Terminator was great. There's another movie that doesn't make sense a lot of times, but I don't care. I've seen it several times, and part of it not making sense is what I like about it. The first one. You won't catch me bashing a movie because it was too action-packed or something like that. Another example of an action science fiction movie with that kind of narrative sophistication that I'm talking about is that Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, Total Recall. And it's very violent. He kills scores, if not hundreds of people in a very immediate, bloody, personal way that, as a teenage boy, I thought was great. But what makes that movie continue to be interesting is this unsolved problem of whose mind is he in and where is he? We're never fully sure what's going on. And it's that kind of suspension of reality and a letting go that I think science fiction can most easily do things where a sort of more reality-based drama has more trouble. Science fiction movies like that really play with the impossible and don't try and reduce the impossible to mechanistic sorts of things. Now, some may argue that those floating mountains and rocks and things are an example of that kind of imagination. And it is nice that stuff's not explained. I don't want to know why parts of Pandora float in the air, defying gravity. But, that was nice. So if Cameron's going to be making future movies like Avatar, or maybe even a sequel to that, I would like to see him push the impossible and the inexplicable instead of trying to provide answers. I don't think the audience really needs a sort of safety blanket of comprehensibility to hang on to. There's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make any sense. That's perfectly good entertainment, and even better, food for thought in the months and years afterward.